Good afternoon or good morning, everyone here in the US, and good evening or good night to those of you who are joining us from elsewhere. My name is Tunç Shen. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of History and the deputy director of the Sakıp Sabancı Center for Turkish Studies here at Columbia University. It is my great pleasure to welcome you all to discuss with our distinguished guests, Yılmaz Güney and Şerif Gören's 1970 classic, Umut, The Hope. Umut is an extremely important movie for many reasons, and I'm sure our panelists today will talk about it in a deeper sense. Today's panel indeed is the last meeting of the semester for Turkey through its cinema series that we've been organizing. But please stay tuned that the series of conversations on contemporary Turkey and its cinema will continue in spring semester with 3 new movies. Before handing the podium over to my esteemed colleague and Sakıp Sabancı visiting professor of Turkish Studies, Zeynep Çelik, I would like to express our gratitude to Sakıp Sabancı family for their continued support to promote Turkish studies here in New York at Columbia University. I should also thank Columbia Global Centers Istanbul for co-sponsoring our film series. And many thanks to Seden Gürlek, the program officer at Global Centers Istanbul, and Ararat Şekeryan, our center's program manager, for their technical support. And finally, I would like to thank everybody in the audience for being with us today and encourage you to join the conversation with your questions. You can submit your questions by using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. So without further ado, I'm passing the torch to Professor Çelik.
Thank you, Tunç. Thank you, the entire team, everybody. Welcome to our panel on Yılmaz Güney. Yılmaz Güney is a legendary figure in Turkish cinema and a very complex personality. I'm certainly not qualified to introduce him. I will leave it to our distinguished guests to discuss his work and his impact and limit myself to a few basic facts. Güney was born in the vicinity of Adana in 1937 and died in Paris in 1984. He directed and acted in scores of films starting in the mid-1960s. Umut, The Hope, which he directed with Şerif Gören in 1970, marked a turning point in his career, both at home and on the international scale. He won the Palme d'Or at the 1982 Cannes Film Festival with Yol, The Road. Yol was another collaboration with Gören, who served as the director in the field. At that time, Güney was in prison and working from there. Yol is Güney's best-known film, but we chose to start today's discussion on with his earlier masterpiece, Umut, because in this film, he is also the lead actor, and we believe much needs to be said about his acting. Let me now introduce our guests in alphabetical order and thank them for accepting our invitation. Melis Behlil is Associate Professor of Cinema Studies and Chair of Radio, Television and Cinema Department at Kadir Has University in Istanbul. She has been a visiting scholar at MIT, a research associate at Stockholm University, and a founding member of European Network for Cinema and Media Studies. She writes film reviews for various publications, co-hosts a weekly radio show, and is a member of the Turkish Film Critics Association and the International Federation of Film Critics. Hamid Dabashi is the Hagop Kevorkian Professor of Iranian Studies and Comparative Literature at Columbia University. He has taught and lectures widely in North American, European, Arab, and Iranian universities. Professor Dabashi has written 22 books, edited 4, and contributed chapters to many more. He's also the author of numerous articles on subjects ranging from Iranian studies to medieval and modern Islam, comparative literature, world cinema, and the philosophy of art. His books and articles have been translated into many languages, among them Turkish. Professor Dabashi teaches courses on a variety of topics, including film studies. Bilge Ebiri is a Turkish-American film critic for New York Magazine and Vulture. His writing has appeared in the New York Times, Rolling Stone, The Village Voice, the Criterion Collection, and many other outlets. He has written extensively on Yılmaz Güney and Turkish cinema. Let me highlight here the Criterion Collection essay he wrote for the release of Hudutların Kanunu, The Law of the Border, 1967, directed by Ömer Lütfü Akat, for which Güney wrote the scenario. Richard Pena is a professor of film and media studies at Columbia University, where he specializes in film theory and international cinema. From 1988 to 2012, he was the program director of the Film Society of Lincoln Center and the director of the New York Film Festivals. At the Film Society, Richard Pena organized retrospectives of many film directors, as well as major film series devoted to world cinema, including a wonderful, very memorable program on Turkish cinema. We are most grateful to Professor Pena for working with us on this series and for agreeing to moderate today's panel. Now I pass the baton to Professor Pena.
Thank you, Zeynep, very much. It's a pleasure once again to be part of this program and to have a chance to talk about Turkish cinema with such a distinguished panel. Let me begin. I've always thought that I kind of knew Yılmaz Güney's work until I really began looking at the filmography. It's such an enormous filmography. I mean, aside from his acting, even the number of films that he directed was far beyond, I guess, what I originally thought. But this leads me to something that I was going to begin with, a little way of throwing down the gauntlet, that somehow, at least in my limited vision, and I've seen, a number of his films, but certainly not even a majority, I've always found Güney more interesting than his films. That I think all his films have, I think the last part of Umut is incredibly great, but they're always something that doesn't really kind of go all the way with me for Yılmaz Güney. But I think he's an extraordinary figure. And I'm wondering if each of our panelists would perhaps comment on that, agreeing or disagreeing. And let me start with Bilge, whose work on Güney has been certainly very revealing to me.
Well, that's a really interesting question. And I think for a lot of us, it's actually very hard to separate Güney from his work because, he embodies the work so much. And especially for Turks of my generation, because, when I was young, you couldn't see Güney films in Turkey. Now, I grew up, after I was 7, I grew up in the US, but here you saw Yol and you saw Duvar, The Wall, his last film that he made in France, but the others were impossible to see. My early years as a cinephile, I was discovering Güney and the work kind of in bits and pieces. I do think that there's something interesting that happens in his films, though, which is maybe getting at why sometimes they're hard to embrace. I mean, the films are, some of them I think are wonderful, but there isn't, he was a very politically committed filmmaker, especially in sort of his last decade and a half or so. But he wasn't necessarily, he hadn't necessarily thought everything through politically. He was the kind of filmmaker, because of his background as kind of an action star and sort of genre knockoffs and things like that, he understood how to sort of, to jerk tears out of an audience, he understood those kinds of things. And I think his stories are very emotional in that sense, but they're also very fable-like. But what happens in almost all of his films, and I've written about this in the past, is that they all kind of fall apart narratively. But I think that's actually intentional because it happens over and over and over again. And you get the sense that what's really happening is the characters are kind of being driven mad by sort of the social circumstances around them. So they really resist any kind of easy closure. It's very hard to carry messages away from the films. And that's actually one of the things that makes it so fascinating for me. But at the same time, of course, so much of his films, or so much of his legacy is based on films that he didn't direct. You know, he was maybe the primary creative figure in them, you know, because he was producing and writing from prison, and often with a lot of control. But one of the things that I think has happened over the past, 15, 20 years or so, we have started to give a little more credit to the other people he worked with, like Zeki Ökten, who made The Herd.
Yeah.
For many years, that was a Yılmaz Güney film. And of course, it is a Yılmaz Güney film, but it's also a Zeki Ökten film. And if you watch Zeki Ökten's other films, it absolutely fits within kind of an auteurist narrative of his work. I think the same could be said of Şerif Gören, especially Yol, which really feels very much like a Şerif Gören film. And that was an interesting thing that happened, of course, at Cannes, because I think it's the first and only time that a producer got up to get the Palme d'Or when Yol won. And then years later, they actually did finally give poor Şerif Gören his Palme d'Or with a movie he directed that has gone down in history as a Yılmaz Güney film.
Actually, could you clear up the authorship of Hope, of Umut? Because in fact, it's listed both ways. In many places, it's listed simply as Yılmaz Güney, and then you also see occasionally Şerif Gören's name being attached to it. What was the story around the direction? Because he was obviously out of prison at that time. He started the film, so. Yeah,
no, and Umut is, I mean, he was not in prison when he did Umut. In fact, Güney had 3 major imprisonments in his career. One was when he was quite young. The other one, I believe, was in 1971. And then the final one was in 74, and then he escaped in 1981. So Umut was not compromised in that way at all. In fact, I don't know too much about what Şerif Gören did on Umut. To me, Umut feels much more like a Güney film than it does a Şerif Gören film. And I do know that the story was actually, Güney actually based the character of Jabbar on his father. And the film was actually shot in his childhood home, or much of the film was shot in his childhood home. It's much more of a Güney film, I think. But Gören had a real facility with documentary realism and that sort of thing, which you can really see in Yol, and you can see that in Umut. So I would venture to say that if his stamp is on Umut, it would be in those scenes, because that's one of the things that was really remarkable about Umut when it first premiered. Is a lot of people in Turkey, a lot of film critics and a lot of people in those circles had never quite seen that kind of authenticity on screen.
Great. Let me turn now to Melish. The question I asked was about Güney, not really versus the film, but almost thinking of Güney and then thinking of the films.
I'll kind of be the devil's advocate here. And as much as I love Umut and as important as Yılmaz Güney is for Turkish cinema, at this point, in 21st century, there's a whole aspect of him being a wife beater as well. So I'll just introduce that in there. And his whole macho sort of persona that is on film that he always also, reflects in his real life. I mean, the last time he was sent to jail was for a drunken brawl and killing someone. As I said, I'll be the one to introduce this here, and I missed a few sentences from Bilge's talk. Very sorry, but I got most of it. But yeah, for me as well, growing up, he was sort of this mythical figure. And when I was first in the US as an exchange student in the early 90s, I actually found a video of Yol, and that was very exciting for me because that was something I could not watch at home. But I actually wasn't able to watch it in full because I felt the dubbing was too theatrical. I see a similar problem with Umut as well. As realistic as the film is, when you pay attention to the accents and how they should probably be speaking, it loses some of that realness. But that compared to other films being made in Turkey at the time, obviously it's a lot more truthful than anything else that was around at the time. So yeah, I mean, I have these mixed feelings about Güney, of him being, this really somewhat of a genius, bringing that kind of realism into Turkish cinema. There was, of course, a lot of discussion about social realism in 1960s, but I think Umut stands somewhere else. But at the same time, when I turn back and look at the way, the kind of lifestyle that he himself represented, it does sort of give me a pause in becoming a huge and unequivocal fan of the man, since you asked about the person and the films. Otherwise, as far as the films go, yes, of course, they're very impressive, very influential. So I'll leave it there for now. I wasn't going to start out with this, but since you asked about,
I brought it up, yeah. Can I ask something, since you also alluded to it? Again, in just my reading, I occasionally see the family in Umut referred to as a Kurdish family. Is that something that's clear to a Turkish viewer? I don't recall it coming out in the subtitles, at least the versions I've seen.
No, I think, I mean, I'm not an expert on accents, but I don't even think they sound Kurdish. It's just sort of implied, and because we know he is Kurdish and this is based on his father somewhat, that's sort of the assumption. I think Bilge might know more about this, but I'm pretty sure it's not pronounced, and even if it were, that probably would have been a problem with censorship.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. And
yeah, I was going to say he wouldn't have been able. I was going to say he wouldn't have been able, I think, to get away with calling them a directly suggesting that they were a Kurdish family in 1970. Yeah. And some of that there can be a bit of it's an understandable revisionism that does happen, because Güney was from a Kurdish family, and he holds a very important place. I mean, I've talked to a lot of Kurdish filmmakers, not just from Turkey, but from Iran and Iraq. For them, Güney has a very special place in their hearts as a Kurdish filmmaker as well. I think he belongs to both worlds. Obviously, he worked in the Turkish film industry. But I do think that in later years, as he became a little more active, and certainly when he was in France, became much more vocal on these issues, there has been a bit more of kind of looking back at his work and sort of making more of these assumptions, which I think is perfectly understandable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I assume probably it was just somebody who assumed, well, he made this film, they must be Kurds or something like that. Finally, let me turn to my old friend Hamid. Great to see you again. Haven't seen you during this long, terrible period. One of the things about Güney is that in the sort of larger context, we can think about him, or at least I think about him, in terms of people like Yusuf Şahin or Lino Broca. These are filmmakers who come from, I hate to use the word, but very commercial industries. But in both cases, they sort of adopted a policy of, okay, 2 for them, 1 for me. In other words, every 3rd or 4th film, they would see as a personal film. And the other work was work they did because they had to, they were in industry. I don't really think that for Güney. It seems to me more of a seamless garment in a way. Your thoughts about that idea of this passage from the commercial to the auteur? Hamid, you have to unmute yourself.
Sorry, I just muted myself not to create noise. Number one, let me say that I must acknowledge that I'm talking to you from Columbia University, which is based on the Lenape Nation, the First Nation on which Columbia University is based, and we must acknowledge. Second, I must say that we have just heard the terrible news that one of our graduate students, David Ajiri, has been murdered last night. So the campus is in shock. And I just thought that our hosts need to know that. Number three, I must say something about our distinguished moderator, Richard. It is impossible to exaggerate the significance of Richard Pena in introducing or enabling the rest of us to talk about world cinema. I know it from personal experience when I just came to Columbia some 30 years ago. And I called Richard because I wanted to teach a course on cinema. And Richard, being in the film division, I was in School of the Arts, I was in other department, and how gracious and helpful he has been over decades of sharing his resources with us. At some point, we even taught together. So it is crucial for people around the world to know, without Richard Pena, there would not be World Cinema Studies at Columbia University. I'm a personal beneficiary of it. Now, with all of that out of the way,
Let's hope, yeah.
Yeah, to your question. I wanted to say something about your first question, Richard, regarding Güne and his cinema. I think I'm kind of an inside outsider. I'm in the presence of great distinguished scholars of Güne. I'm not a scholar of Güne. I saw Yol first. You remember when you and I multiple times in Paris and Cannes. I was in Paris and somewhere in Quartier Latin, and I just walk into one of these fantastic dilapidated movie theaters, and I saw Yol. I had no clue who is Yılmaz Güney. I had no clue who is Şerif Gören. I was utterly mesmerized. I came out of movie theater walking in daze thinking, what was that? Who made that? I had two identical experiences. One was with Novecento, 1900 of Bertolucci, which again I saw in similar circumstances. And one was with Yılmaz Güney. So under the spell of that, later on I learned about his being political, being Kurdish, being in prison, in, out, etc. I never heard of him being a wife beater or anything like that. But all of those are crucial if somebody is writing about the biography of Yılmaz Güney. But when it comes to his cinema, he did something. And now, as I said multiple times watching Umut, we are in the presence of a magnificent filmmaker. The first comparison, Richard, as I'm sure you will know, is Osman Senben's similar film about, it's a short film, is back in 1960s that he did about a carriage driver and so forth. Forum Saret. But it also reminded me of Doroskechi, of Iranian films. Many aspects of the film reminds me of Naderi's Water, Wind, Dust, etc. There are scenes and shots of a great influence of Satyajit Roy. I mean, we are in the presence of a filmmaker, knowingly or unknowingly. I don't know how much. I mean, here in New York, we recognize Scorsese as this encyclopedia. He has watched everything. We don't know. I mean, I don't know if Güney was watching films or not, but whether intuitively or by erudition, there is a lot of world cinema in him. And as a result, 21st century, over the last week that I have been watching for the first time, I did not know Umut. I had not seen Umut, and I'm grateful for this magnificent print that Ararat sent to us to watch. I began to think of other way of thinking about Turkish cinema, not in terms of, national cinema, Turkish cinema, Kurdish cinema, Iranian cinema, Palestinian cinema, etc., but in terms that will enable us to decontextualize actually Yılmaz Güney's cinema from its Turkish national or Kurdish national setting and recontextualize him in a context that make him comparable to other great filmmakers. And that decontextualization and recontextualization enables us to look at the figure of Jabbar, yes, as perhaps Turkish, yes, as perhaps Kurdish character, but something else is happening in what we are seeing that I hope I will have a chance to talk more.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Just let me kind of continue the discussion with the question that really, I think, haunts the first part of realism, especially for Melish and Bilge. What was realism understood to be? Was there an impact, for example, of neorealism, Italian neorealism, the kind of classic version in Turkish cinema? Or was there something, I mean, the first part of Umut is really hard to watch. I mean, it's rare that I've seen a film that, at least for me, shoves me not only into a situation, and I have to admit, I always have a hard time watching children getting beaten. That just is one of those things that I kind of, draw back from. But how is realism understood within that context? Was it sort of Güney saying, look at how we live, or look at how some of us live, or do you see it in another way? Start with you, Melish.
Okay, I'll sort of try to contextualize it with the debates going on at the time. I'm sure some of our attendees are familiar with Turkish film history, but for others, the Turkish film industry became very popular within Turkey starting from late 50s, but particularly in 1960s. But most of the films made were largely melodramas or kind of very conventional comedies. And there were dozens, hundreds of these made. So it was a very big industry, following in the footsteps of Indian, Egyptian industries of the time. And
I think actually in 1970, 300 films were made in Turkey.
Yes, in the 70s, it becomes even bigger. So it is a very big industry. It's among the top few in the world at the time in terms of films made, and also in terms of films watched within the country. So people do go see these films all around the country. And in fact, there's this whole system of distribution. There are several regions in the country, and distributors in each region are in touch with movie theaters, and whichever films prove to be popular with the audiences, they ask for similar films from Istanbul where they're being made. So similar things, all cliches and everything are being reproduced again and again. Within that, of course, there are other people trying to create a new kind of cinema from 1960s after the coup d'etat and the new constitution. There is this sense of a possible freedom that also comes with, of course, the new cinemas of Latin America and, of course, Europe. And there's this, the Cinematheque is founded in the 60s. And a lot of people are watching the Western films and discussing them, but there's also among the filmmakers a movement that counters that, more along the lines of third cinema, perhaps, advocating for a more national cinema, true Turkish cinema that uses traditional ideas, traditional stories. And Halit Refi is the famous director and critic who actually wrote about this. But filmmakers like Metin Erksan, Halit Refi, Lütfü Akats mentioned, are trying to create different styles, separating themselves from the mainstream melodramas, mainstream Yeşilçam, Green Pine films. So, to think of Yılmaz Güney's cinema, we need to take that context into consideration as well, I think, because he didn't just come out of nowhere, but he does come from very much that popular filmmaking. He is part of that as an actor and then as a director. So there's this, obviously he would know about the other filmmakers, but I'm not sure, of course, as Professor Debashi said, if he would be familiar with Boram Saret, which was made only maybe, I think, 7 years before. Mm-hmm. But it's certainly in there. And then especially as you said in the beginning, neorealism is certainly in there, just waiting for the train to arrive, waiting for the people to get off, waiting for the costume, just waiting for the longest time. In fact, after losing his horse, his kind of like losing your bicycle as you got your job and you need the bicycle. And Borom Saret is almost exactly the same in the sense that he loses his horse. So there are all these parallels. And I think there is also a parallel with third cinema as well, reflecting on his own past and the local culture and so on. But beyond the national, it's also very class-based. So instead of us being well aware of him being Kurdish, which of course is also difficult politically at the time, but we are aware that he's poor and he's systematically being prevented from creating a new life for himself, including his children, because the daughter can't study and that she fails at school and enters the same cycle. So the class consciousness, I'd say, is a lot more visible. I'm not sure if that answers some of your questions, but
no, I think you did something. Thank you. I gave us a good Turkish context for thinking of his work, because in a way, and we turn to Bilge for this, when did Turks think of Güney, for example, within the context of directors such as Erden Kral or Ali Ogunturk or Atif Yilmaz, people who, at least to me, were sort of the art film directors of Turkey? Did that distinction, well, talk about that distinction if you would.
Well, it would be, for different filmmakers, it would be different things. But Ali Özgentürk was one of Güney's assistants and in fact co-wrote a couple of his later films. So he definitely comes out of that world, although he forges a different path. Although his first films, I think, bear a lot of, owe a great debt to Güney. And Erden Kral, of course, also. Erden Kral
was supposed to direct Yol, actually.
He was supposed to direct Yol. So, and then got fired, and then later made a movie about Güney trying to make Yol, which is actually a very good film. Although I did talk to Ali Özgentürk about it, and he didn't like it very much at the time, if I remember correctly. But I think Güney would have been seen. I mean, it depends on. Honestly, it's kind of in the eye of the beholder, right? I mean, the average Turkish viewer might not have been necessarily aware of all these different directors. But, Atif Yilmaz, Güney gets his start working for Atif Yilmaz, right? Before he's even an actor, he's an assistant for Atif Yilmaz. In fact, it's on the set of an Atif Yilmaz film where the cops show up and take him away for his first prison sentence. And Güney owes a great debt to these filmmakers who came before him. I guess they're a generation of, though in many cases they were only like 10 or 12 years older than him. But I mean, one of the biggest things that happens in Güney's career is when he hooks up with Lütfü Akkad, whose films he had been, he'd been a great admirer of Akkad's. Because remember, Güney as a kid works for a film distribution company in Adana, and he gets on his bicycle and like carries film reels around, and very often is often watching them. And in fact, he meets a very young Ali Özgentürk around that time, and letting him in to watch movies for free and things like that. So he comes out of this context of a very kind of grassroots cinephilia, if you will. But in terms of when he meets Lütfü Akkad, he brings to Lütfü Akkad, this is when they make The Law of the Borders together. Akkad had been kind of not making films for a little while, and he was suffering from professional burnout, and he thought his career was over. Güney comes to him with a screenplay, and Akkad reads it. This is 1966 or so. Akkad reads the script, and he talks about this in his memoir. He says that the script was, unfilmable. It was terrible. It was this kind of schlocky genre thing. The basic premise of the Law of the Borders, but it was kind of one of these like schlocky revenge pictures that Güney had been starring in. And Akkad goes to him and says, "Listen, I'm going to make this movie, but I'm going to rewrite it." And then Akkad actually goes out and does tons of research, because it's a film about smugglers. And he actually goes out and actually interviews smugglers and goes out to the area where this, because it's on the U.S. On the Turkish-Syrian border, and he goes into this deep research into the subject matter of the film, and the finished film is wonderful. And I think that's kind of where Güney understands that that he himself, given his star persona, can actually forge a different path. Because after that, a couple of years after that, he makes his first, I believe he has his first directorial debut. And even though some of the films he initially directed were also sort of action knockoffs,
right,
he starts to, even before Umut, he starts to make films that have a real kind of dose of realism to them. But I was going to add one more thing. I think, in terms of what other films from like world cinema he would have been aware of, I mean, I think, there was a pretty rich cinephile culture in Turkey in the 50s and 60s. And, they would have been aware of neorealism and things like that. I sincerely doubt they'd seen Borum Saray. A lot of third cinema probably would not have been available to them. Some of those films would probably have been banned in Turkey, frankly. But they're very much aware of kind of the sort of mainstream trends in international cinema. A lot of those films are coming through the Cinematheques and things like that.
Let me turn to Hamid now with a question. Looking at the film again, one of the things that really struck me was the character, I'm sorry I'm blanking on his name for a moment, the older man who is a religious figure. And one of the things that struck me, and I say this in the context of a completely out of control Islamophobia going on in this country, that one could read that or read that character in a negative way, that the film is making a critique of a religion which promises and promises and doesn't deliver. Do you see it that way, or how would you interpret that character and the role of religion writ large within the film?
Unmute myself. I can see, Richard, how religion can be looked at that way. But having just seen the movie like 2 or 3 times, I'm actually mesmerized by the ease with which Yılmaz Güney, Şerif Gören transition from very harsh realism into this phantasmagoric fascination with the possibility of a hidden treasure and under the ground, etc. So if you kind of take those characters, those religious characters, recitations from the Quran and the memorization of this and that, out of that context of the film, yes, it can be seen that way. But the way that it is actually done, namely the seamless transition, the man is traumatized after the death of his horse, which, as you know, is very reminiscent of the movie Cow, but
made almost at the same time.
Yeah, exactly. When he loses his cow, that he goes through also, you remember there are religious characters in that village based on Saidi. But in my opinion, Umut is far more successful because of this. It begins with very harsh realism, those unbelievable Satyajit Ray-like shots of the interior and so forth, into this desperation. And the transitional period is when his friends say, why don't you go rob? Yes, we can start killing people and robbing people. But so the transition into that moment when salvation and the possibility, and also the sort of, I would say, the last third part of the film, that we are in this desert kind of a sort of geography of hapless circumstances, that it is he recalibrate religious sensibilities into the fusion of realism into surrealism of his cinema. So if we pay attention to the context, that kind of Islamophobia is prevented.
Let me turn that question to both Melis and Bilge. How do you see the role or the place of a religious figure within this film? How would that have been seen, to the best of your knowledge, in the Turkey of 1970?
I mean, obviously, I think it wouldn't have been seen as Islamophobia, since that's the sort of overwhelming religion, but it would be very anti-religious, although I think the man himself, the older figure, isn't, I mean, he is negative, but he seems more like a silly sort of old man who even believes what he's saying, although it's all nonsense. And it's made very clear to us with the kids looking at things and talking about them, and everyone believing that that's the treasure is in the house and so on. But I would consider it to be very anti-religious and presenting religion and blind faith as something that prevents the poor, the underprivileged from actually being able to maybe unite and try to fight for their rights. And instead he chooses it doesn't let the main character off the hook either. I mean, he's very willing to believe that. He doesn't want to fight for his right or go unionize or try another way out. But this seems to be a lot more practical, just quick money when you just find the right place.
Yeah, you make, I think, two very good points. I mean, he does have the chance to join with other drivers in a protest, and he says, well, I don't have a horse anymore or something, so he can't really do it. And the second thing is, I do think that while I myself see it as critical, he's not critical of the man. I mean, the man is treated rather sympathetically, and seems not quite as deluded as Gabar eventually becomes, but seems someone very tired and whatever. Anyway, Bill, any thoughts on that?
I mean, I think I would agree with everything you guys have said. It's not, he's not a caricature. And in a film where you do sometimes get broad characterizations, this character is actually treated quite gently, which is interesting, even though, his effect is clearly a negative one. And I think that there is something to, I mean, obviously Turkey was this is a whole other can of worms to open, but in terms of, secular Turkey and Islamic Turkey and the tension between them and what would have been allowed and what would not have been allowed and what would have been acceptable in a mainstream movie and things like that. But also given Güney's own kind of growing Marxism at this time, there is obviously a social critique there. But you're right. I mean, this character is treated gently as this kind of pathetic figure. Now, the story of Jabbar digging up the house and things like that stuff, as I understand it, was in fact taken from Güney's childhood. His father had dug up the house looking for buried treasure. So maybe what's happening there is that Güney is actually kind of reaching back to some kind of sympathy he might have had for these characters. So anyway, that was all I was going to add.
Okay. Thinking about the film in terms of the depiction of the family, again, that was something, especially the relationship between the parents and children, that for me was really quite shocking. I mean, I rarely have seen a film where there was that kind of just everyday brutality, sort of exhibited. Thoughts about that? And again, why do you think it's in the film? Why was that something that Güney wanted or needed to show, other than the fact that perhaps it was a reflection on his own past? Bilge, want to start?
Yeah, I can get into that a little bit. I mean, I do think that the way the film is structured and the way the film is cut, you do get the sense that the violence at home is a direct result of the desperation of these characters. Because I mean, he'll do something like, he'll just cut randomly to a scene of a child being beaten and then just cut out of it and go on with the story. So it's not like it's not like there are many narrative things happening there. It's just, I mean, it's almost like a grace note. The grace note is obviously the wrong word. But that's something, I mean, that kind of, violence towards kids and things like that is something you actually do see a lot of in Güney's films. I mean, I don't know if you've ever seen The Wall, his final film, which is
well, of course, but that's in a prison, so.
It's in a prison. But I mean, there's an interesting story with that because at the time of The Wall, there was a documentary made for French TV on the set of the film. And it showed Güney, and a lot of these kids were the children of exiles, because he was shooting in France, obviously. and they weren't actors and things like that. And it shows Güney trying to get these kids to cry and things like that. And I mean, some people see him abusing them. I haven't actually seen that. I mean, in many cases, he's showing actors how to kind of convincingly hit somebody on screen, and it looks very convincing, but I don't think he's actually hitting them. But he is terrorizing them to try and get these performances out of them. So, and it's actually a really, really tough movie to watch. And at the time, there was a real backlash to Güney when that documentary came out. And it, you know, I mean, obviously, you know, he's a problematic, as Mendes has mentioned, he's a problematic figure in many, many ways. But that is, you know, this depiction of that kind of social and familial violence is something you see in his films all the time. And in fact, you see it, I mean, I've always felt that Yol is in many ways a film about violence towards women. Mm-hmm. You know, so it's something, it's something you definitely see in Güney. And I think Umut is one of the first depictions of it.
Milish, along with the violence of the children, there's also a great deal of violence oriented towards his wife. And when I was looking over his biography, curiously, it's sort of in the period, or the film was made in a period when he divorces his first wife and marries his second wife. You know, not wanting to get too autobiographical, but how do you see, you know, the character of the woman in the film, of the wife, I'm sorry, I should say?
Well, what you just said, I think, is important, because the character of the woman is the wife, the mother. I mean, we don't really know much else about her other than she's fed up and she's a mother. But there's also still this love between them as he's leaving. You know, she's upset and she wants to make love. I actually see her as a strangely strong woman at the same time, because she is powerful enough to complain and to, you know, point out that he's not really being very helpful and so on. But I think the whole violence within the family also sort of implies the more general cycle of violence, because it starts from the father to one of the kids to the smaller kid, from him to the little puppy around. So it, you know, and you can take it in the other direction towards the state, you know, the way the police treat Jabbar, and the way he's treated all his life, the way his daughter is treated at school. So I think it's also indicative of a larger, not maybe tradition, but sort of ingrained violence, not necessarily always physical violence, but also emotional or sort of social, casting a certain class completely aside and making them invisible, which is in itself a form of violence.
One scene that really stands out, which you just mentioned, because it's so different really from every other thing in the film, is the scene of the daughter at school, going through this English exam, I guess you would call it. Your thoughts about this scene? It's curious because there's really almost nothing else in the film that looks like it. Maybe you could compare it a little bit to when he goes to the rich man's house with the children in the swimming pool or something like that. But, you know, it's again such a kind of awful scene because she's obviously trying so hard and not getting there. Hamid, some thoughts on that scene?
First, let me, Richard, say a few words about this question of child beating, which I think is very important. Maybe this is also something to do with the culture of filmmaking at the time in the 1970s. I was just reminded of a horrific rape scene in Hitchcock's Frenzy, that when I recently watched it, I said, my God, it would be impossible for that sequence to be allowed, even to be shot, let alone to be seen. That's one thing. The other thing, I want to draw sort of attention to two formal aspects of Umut. One is the way that in editing, Yılmaz Güney and Gören, they create a collage of shots, consciously or subconsciously, I don't know, in which the scenes of violence is really located within a larger frame of references that kind of contextualizes. The other thing that I noticed, in fact, last night was watching was the preponderance of long shots. Mm-hmm. These long shots have this effect of, alienating from sort of a Verfremdungseffekt, Brechtian Verfremdungseffekt, from those specific scenes of violence, of desperation, of poverty. All of those are there, but formally, I think there is a built-in mechanism of strangeness, or stranieri, as it is called, that sort of contextualizes and doesn't allow a single shot or a single scene to redefine the text. Yeah.
No, I think you're very correct. I mean, those scenes, I mean, the one, again, kind of horrible, remarkable scene when Güney is there and his wife is really exploding and he eventually hits her. Then he sits down and he hits each of the kids, but it's all done in long shot. And it is a kind of very interesting, in that way, he doesn't draw into a close-up. He doesn't sort of move it so that we see the moment she's hit. It's all done, to use, maybe following on your Brechtian allusion, it all seems a little bit kind of almost theatrical, in that way.
Exactly.
It's really shown this kind of, going from the wife to the kids and on down.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay, we've got some questions, but before we go on to those, let me throw out another big question. Do you think it's helpful for us to perhaps use a description of Güney of someone who you might call an organic intellectual in the Gramsci sense, somebody who, in a certain way, comes to his politics, comes to his feelings, not through education, whatever, but just the experience of life, in a way that, again, makes him different from a Shaheen or a Lino Brocca, both of whom were educated, came from middle-class backgrounds, had some international connections, whatever. Güney doesn't seem to have any of that. Is that a helpful way for us to think of Güney?
I think you can maybe see it. I mean, you can sort of he maybe meets you halfway there, because, I mean, a lot of his education actually happened in prison. So where he is actually reading books and things like that. So I mean, there is there's a kind of autodidact quality to that. But also, he was, I mean, and he's in prison from, fairly young age. But obviously he's coming from a background where a lot of this stuff would have made sense to him, given that he's seen, because he's not coming from a middle-class background. And he's so there is a kind of sense of, but at the same time, he's a very popular rich movie star for part of his life before he starts making some of these movies. So there's also, I mean, the man is filled with just intense contradictions.
Mm-hmm. I'm sorry, Hamid, do you want to jump into that?
I can wait, yeah.
Malish is saying you can go first.
Yeah, go ahead, Hamid.
I was just noticing the coincidence of Richard raising the question of organic intellectual and Bill Gates talking about his prison experiences, that we're now, Gramsci's prison notebooks, right? Or his entire cinema is his prison notebooks. I can see, Richard, how one can biographically see him as an organic intellectual. But again, I want to say, because I'm fresh out of watching Umut, sort of entirely out of biographical context, and constantly being reminded of other great filmmakers, that at the first quarter of the 21st century, films such as Umut and even his entire other oeuvre have assumed a renewed aesthetic significance, formal significance, that yes, they carried within them biographical, historical, national, all of those contexts. But nevertheless, the formal references and allusions to other great filmmakers from Latin America, from Africa, etc., should enable us to begin to think of the figure of Jabbar as an anti-hero, as a figure. When I was watching him, in fact, I was thinking of Benjamin's notion of Trauerspiel, of the tragic drama, of the moment when mythology begins to yield to allegory. And the reason that we can identify with him now today is not necessarily biographical, historical, or that he was a Kurdish activist or a revolutionary or a Marxist. All of them are legitimate references, the way for us to understand, including the question of national cinema. But still, I can't help thinking that when you look at the oeuvre of his writing, the entirety of his authorship, from mid-60s into mid-80s, the 2 decades of filmmaking, that we are in the presence of, whether intuitive or cultivated or a fusion of both, filmmaker that has left behind, I mean, he died very young, he died in his late 40s, that occasions a kind of formal and aesthetic reflection and a poetic reflection, even poetics of violence, that are not entirely, in my opinion, reducible to our parameters of national cinemas, the way we have understood them.
Meilish, in an article that Bilge wrote about Güney, he quotes Jim Hoberman and says that Yılmaz Güney is something of a combination of Clint Eastwood, James Dean, and Che Guevara. Which of those do you think sort of continues in terms of the legacy of Yılmaz Güney, if any?
Okay, Clint Eastwood, Che Guevara, who was the second?
James Dean.
Yeah, and ugly James Dean.
Ugly James Dean.
You know, he's called the ugly king. And you know, it's not my personal opinion of his looks, but that was his what he was called. I think it's sort of evolved maybe over time. I mean, not so much James Dean, not just because of the looks, but in general, I think he's got a lot more agency than James Dean ever had a chance to. Clint Eastwood, in the sense of taking that movie stardom and turning it into becoming a respectable auteur, but with very different politics. And Che Guevara, in a very sort of inspiring way, and having become kind of like a poster figure. I think, even though, you know, he's the not filmmaker in this group, I think that might be the closest of the three in a way, in terms of, you know, in terms of essence.
Was he a figure of resistance in Turkey before perhaps he articulated that resistance?
I'll leave that to Bilge. I'm really not sure I can answer that.
Sorry, can you clarify that question though?
I guess what I'm asking, you know, there are times when people get, how could you, appropriated as the symbol of something. And, you know, sometimes they are, sometimes they aren't. I wonder in the case of Güney if he sort of evolved into it, that he actually became the figure of resistance that people intuited in his work.
Well, he absolutely did become a figure of resistance. In terms of the question of when that shift happened, I mean, you know, I wasn't around to see that happening in the 70s. I'm not that old, but I think, I mean, it probably happened fairly early because you know, his films were being banned. His film, you know, remember, he's incredibly popular, and one of the things that allows him to do the things he does from prison. The thing that allows him to like make movies from prison is, one of the reasons is the soldiers and you know, the prison guards are all huge fans of his. You know, I mean, they'll let him do these things. They'll let him like edit movies in prison and things like that. And one of the things that happens with Yol is, you know, obviously because Yol is shooting before he flees and really becomes total persona non grata. But you know, like a lot of the scenes in Yol of like soldiers invading Kurdish villages and things like that, those are real soldiers. And you know, they would go to these guys and say, "Can you show us, you know, how you would invade this village?" Like, you know, I mean, so there's like this document. Obviously, Şerif Gören is the person doing that, but in some cases, they would use Yılmaz Güney's name to kind of open these doors for them. So, and that goes both ways. That shows you what a huge figure he was. But of course, he's also a huge iconic figure among people who you would not necessarily classify as, resistance figures. So he's just enormously popular. And once he starts to become a kind of, obviously once he goes to prison, but before that, once his films start getting banned, then obviously much more so.
Was there a problem when Umut was banned? I mean, was there protest or what was the reaction to that?
It's my understanding that it was banned, but not at first. It did. This was something that actually happened with a number of his films, where they would screen, they would open, they'd become huge hits, and then they get banned, which is a very good way to turn someone into an icon.
Right, exactly.
So
bad strategy.
Yeah, that's like, there's no better marketing strategy than that. But no, and as I understand it, Umut did run into problems after it came out, because there's a lot of, scripts are submitted to censors and things like that. They look at the script, they say, oh, well, this seems fine. And then the movie comes out and they say, oh my God, all these people are seeing, these horrible things happening in our country. We should maybe stop that from happening. So.
Hamid, give you the final word.
As you and Bill Gates were talking about how banning films, as you know, being banned for an Iranian filmmaker is tantamount to $1 million advertisement for the film. I was thinking of Gilles Pontecorvo's Battle of Algiers, how it's being banned in France for years, became one of the factors in making the film the legendary film that it is. I'm reminded of when you hosted. We do miss you, Richard, in that context. When you hosted Gilles Pontecorvo and Edward Said in that magnificent conversation that I was present. But again, Richard, I want to end on the note that, yes, all of these political contexts, revolutionary disposition, Kurdish nationalism, all of these things are all there. And my distinguished colleagues are far more qualified to talk about that. But as an outsider, I really want to re-emphasize that there is something of Satyajit Roy in his cinema. There is something of Kiarostami in his cinema. There is something of this magic realism, especially in Umut, that begins so stark realism and then transmutes in this phantasmagoric. That final shot of his being blindfolded and walking around in search of what exactly. And also this fusion of collages and long shots that begins to create an atmospheric cinema of the entire genre that will really, brings as a gift to the next generation of film scholars and film cineasts of a great manifestation of Turkish cinema that he represented. Because these cannot be, yes, perhaps he was aware of other cinematic experiences, but there is something extraordinarily natural, normal, Turkish, quote unquote, Kurdish, quote unquote, about his cinema, which is, if I were to say the last word, the gift of Turkish cinema to world cinema.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I would say I agree with something you mentioned before. For me, there are many things about the film that are quite remarkable. For me, the most remarkable is that transition between the first 2/3 of the film and the final third.
Exactly.
I know of very few films, literally, in history,
and do it so seamless,
such a U-turn and do it so successfully.
Exactly.
So that it happens and you're suddenly in a very different film, in a very different world, and it never feels artificial. It feels like it comes perfectly from everything that went on before, no matter how different it is. So I very much agree with your observation, Hamid. Let me look now. We have a number of questions in our Q&A. Question from an anonymous attendee. What was the reception of Umut among leftist as well as conservative filmmaker critics of the time? Anyone want to or know about that? Or,
as I understand it, it was well regarded by critics. I don't know enough about what conservative critics. I don't even know who would have been a conservative critic at the time. I mean, it's not like there are millions of film critics, right? It's not film Twitter in 1970. But it is interesting because it does, Attila Dorsai, who is one of
Yes.
one of the great Turkish film critics. I believe this is the first Turkish film that he reviews.
Really?
Up until that point, he had reviewed international films. Because
Wow.
remember, and this is something Melis touched on as well. There's a kind of tension in the cinephile world in Turkey at this time, because they're the cinephiles who kind of congregate around the Cinematheque in Istanbul are really they're fascinated, in love with international cinema, the films that are coming. It's the 60s, right? But they hold Turkish cinema, including artists like Metin Erksan and Lütfü Akkad, at a bit of a remove, because to them, these guys can't quite match, the Godards and the Antonionis of the world. And in fact, this is Metin Erksan, who makes Dry Summer and wins the award in, I always forget if it's Berlin or Venice, where he wins the big prize. And Berlin, right? And he thinks he's going to come back. This is a guy who was given his life to cinema and to Turkish cinema, and he thinks he's going to come back to Turkey as kind of as a conquering hero, and just nobody cares. In that world, in the cinephile world. But I get, but with Umut, I think things change. I'm being a little too, clear cut in describing these rifts. But I do think with Güney, a lot of intellectual film critics do start to take notice.
Mm-hmm. There's also I'm sorry, Melis. Yeah.
I actually just checked the awards to see, and apparently the second Adana Film Festival was held that year, and it won most of the awards, like best film, best director, script, actor, director of photography, which is understandable because he is from Adana and it's an Adana film, so it's very normal for it to be embraced there. But it also won best actor in Antalya, which would be more established Istanbul sort of Yeşilçam filmmakers. So that does say something.
Another question here, basically going on a little bit of what we said before about neorealism. It said Ladra di Biciclette, Bicycle Thieves, was an overwhelming reference which limited the film's reception and interpretive framework within the Cinematheque circle. Do you think is that a way that, in a sense, the film was read almost too much as neorealism?
I don't know if that was a question, but I would take this person at their word. They seem to know what they're talking about. That certainly would make sense. Because remember, Turkish cinema is very, one of the things they do, maybe more in the 70s, but they do it in the 60s, is they'll take kind of, big hits from the West and make their own versions of them. So I would not be surprised if some people saw this and said, well, this is just, Turkish cinema trying to remake Bicycle Thieves, although obviously that's not exactly what's happening here. Right. But yeah, so.
But even just to add to Bilge's note, and it's not even just from the West, right? It's also from Indian films. Avare was remade as Avare, and I'm sure many others. So it's borrowing from everywhere.
Mm-hmm. Hamid, I'm wondering, was Turkish cinema known at all in Iran? Especially considering you have an Azeri population and...
Not really. Turkish literature, Aziz Nesin who was a satirist back when I was, in the 60s. He was a very prominent and known figure, but not Turkish cinema. But the question of Bicycle Thief or Satyajit, Melissa is absolutely correct. We have to go outside European context to see, for example, what was happening in Egyptian cinema, even before Yusuf Shaheen, and in Indian cinema and Russian cinema. Russian formalism was greatly present. Locates films like Umut in a larger regional context that perhaps is equally important.
Yeah. No, I think it's an interesting consideration to think of it regionally in terms of the kind of tensions. Another viewer, actually, this is really more about Güney's work, wanted to talk about the influence of the Italian spaghetti Western on Güney's work, and mentions especially his film Elegy. Anyone want to take that one up? That's a film, unfortunately, I haven't seen, so I can't really respond to that. Although certainly I think there are, I always kind of balk at the use of the word Western, because I like to think of the outdoor adventure film, because indeed, I mean, you know, samurai films aren't Westerns, but they're outdoor adventure films, you know, and, you know, we sort of, it's a kind of problem with terminology, you know, so nothing against Westerns, but, you know, let's just keep it a little more general than that.
I can answer that. I think, well, first of all, they would have been, I mean, the Leone spaghetti Westerns, I don't think open in Turkey until late 67 or so. I mean, they don't even open in the US until, you know, late 60s. But they were, Güney makes more than one Western. I mean, Güney stars in tons of Westerns, and they are Westerns. I mean, they are like, they're shot in Turkey, but they are Westerns. They got the hats, they got the horses, they got the guns. And a lot of them are knockoffs of, you know, other Westerns. And very often, a lot of his films, in fact, including, I don't remember if Ağıt does this. I remember liking Ağıt, but he makes Ağıt at the same time as Acı. And one is called Elegy, the other is called Pain. I think he actually shoots them both while he's doing his military service. So a lot of these films, like, I would have to like sit down and actually rewatch the movie like immediately to be able to tell you specifics about it. But a lot of these films, they actually use the Morricone music from the various spaghetti Westerns, not just the Leone ones, but the other ones. I mean, they love Morricone, and they will use that music in a lot of these films. And Güney uses that music in a couple of his films. That doesn't necessarily mean he's seen the films, but I would imagine that by that point that he had. Mm-hmm. I mean, also, Italian cinema is big. You know, when I was a little kid, I remember I saw all sorts of Italian sci-fi knockoffs of Star Wars and things like that, and Italian knockoffs of Jaws before I saw the real things. Like, they would actually come to Turkey before the real ones came. So you know, there's kind of a real sort of cross-cultural exchange happening there.
Yeah, it's interesting also, I mean, the theme of so many of his films, even the few that I've seen, is so often revenge, you know, and revenge, you know, becomes the Western plot, certainly of the 50s. I mean, you know, it's the idea of someone who has to move outside of society and, you know, undertake their revenge before they can go back in or something like that, which seems to be, again, a theme and a kind of prototype that I think Güney also employed.
I'd like to mention a documentary here. I'm sure some of you are familiar with it, but it's called Remake, Remix, Ripoff. It's by Cem Kaya, who's based in Germany, but he's originally from Turkey. And it's all about this, you know, 60s and 70s remake culture in Turkey. And there's a whole scene where this producer's showing LPs that he owns of very famous film music, Morricone and all of that. And he goes, this one we used for this, and this one we used for that. And well, they've already made it. What we're supposed to pay for all of this? We needed the music. It's really funny. And you know, if you get a chance, it's a great documentary.
I'd love to see it. It sounds like an early example of sampling, you know, of just, hey, it's there, let's just use it, you know? Okay, let me see. I think we got one more question. No, I just more kind of talk about the Westerns and people sort of admiring that. Last comments from any of you? Anything you'd like to add that you didn't mention or that we should perhaps think of? Meilish, can I start with you? Any final word?
Well, one word that I should have said at the beginning, I also want to pay my respect and admiration to Richard Peña, because he was the first film professor I ever had at Columbia, and it's one of the reasons I do what I do now. So it's a great honor and pleasure to be here with you today. Maybe just very briefly also talk about sort of Yılmaz Güney's legacy. I mean, there was all this talk when Three Monkeys came out, Nuri Bilge Ceylan's, obviously, you know, the younger realist or social realist filmmakers all talk about their debt to Yılmaz Güney, but when Three Monkeys came out with a story of a driver being paid for the boss's, taking over boss's crime, many people, of course, compared that to Yılmaz Güney's film, and even in places where you don't expect to see Güney, we seem to pick it up even if he's not there consciously. So he does have a very strong legacy on Turkish cinema, I would say.
Okay.
And Kurdish cinema.
Okay. Hamid, give you the second word.
Again, I'm absolutely grateful and happy to be part of this conversation. Haven't seen you, Richard, for a long time, so this is a icing on the cake. Just want to repeat what I said earlier, namely placing great filmmakers like Yılmaz Güney in the regional context rather than specific references to Bicycle Thief, great as that film is, or Spaghetti Western, etc. I was just thinking of Amir Naderi's Tangsir, that you know well, that it is deeply influenced by John Ford and the whole Western tradition, but there is not a single shot in the film that nobody can tell, but it is predicated on awareness of and admiration and love for John Ford. And I think that historically we are at a point to begin, and you, Richard, have done extraordinary groundwork on our campus, to begin to rethink of national cinemas, Turkish cinema, Iranian cinema, Egyptian cinema, Syrian cinema. There is a lot of Muhammad Malas I sort of detected in Yılmaz Güney. There are these regional contexts, some intentional, some accidental, that requires a reconfiguration of our understanding of national cinemas in more regional and comparative contexts. And conversations such as this with colleagues who know very closely the details of one particular master filmmaker would do the groundwork for those comparative studies in the regional context, including European, but not just one-to-one with the European context.
I agree very much. I think the next frontier, I hope, for film historical studies will be truly comparative studies, where we can think of, the outdoor adventure film, and then really look at all its manifestations without thinking, okay, there's the Western paradigm, who copies it and how?
Exactly.
It's too much of our film history has been written like that, as opposed to just seeing manifestations. Even a better example is the musical. There's hardly a national culture that doesn't have a musical film tradition, but they're not all the same, So anyway, those are my two.
Just one quick note. In my own childhood, I grew up with three musical traditions: Indian musicals, Egyptian musicals, and Hollywood musicals, and they were entirely interchangeable. Yes, Hollywood was there, but equally Indian and Egyptian. So in our mind, the three of them all, singing in the rain could be in Hindi, or could be Raj Kapoor will sing.
And Bilge, please.
I think the thing I would end on is, it's interesting because some of the things we've talked about, one of the things that actually does make it sometimes hard for people to, especially today, to be able to watch, even though the films are much more widely available now than they were, 20, 30 years ago, it's sometimes hard to appreciate them because these filmmakers were dealing with such technical limitations. Güney is the first person in Turkish cinema, if I remember correctly, to be able to edit with 3 audio tracks so that he can cut from, so that he can overlay music and things like that and fade it out and things like that. And he doesn't get to do that until 1974's The Friend. Well before Umut. So you'll see, you made the note about sampling. It actually is like sampling, because you'll hear the music, the music will burst in and then it'll cut right out because they don't have the sophisticated materials to, and this is the 70s, Coppola's making The Godfather. He's making The Conversation. And meanwhile, these poor guys are dealing with these tiny, single audio tracks and things like that, and equipment that's falling apart on them very often. but related to that, I would also note that, we think of, because Güney is such a huge, huge figure in Turkey, and because his body of work is actually quite immense and goes through several periods, we sometimes forget the fact that, at this moment, I believe I'm older than Yılmaz Güney was when he died. So this is a career that was really cut short. And what we're really watching is a filmmaker in various stages of development.
Mm-hmm.
And, one of the interesting things that I mentioned earlier, that French documentary about the making of the Wall, in it, I believe it's in that one, he's interviewed about actually, the attitudes towards women in Turkey and things like that. And he's talking, and he actually talks very frankly about how he himself, is quite complicit in this, in this kind of thing. And talks about how he's trying to become a better person, about how his political awakening has actually kind of made him much more aware of these things. And this is like a year before he dies. So this is a figure who really was in kind of mid-transformation when he died. And we have to remember that. I think, it is a life cut short. It is a career cut short. And while the body of work that we have is huge and impressive, the mind reels at what might have been possible.
Mm-hmm.
I would leave us on that.
The enormous potential, and even beyond cut short, compromised, even by working with talented directors, but never exactly being precisely him. So it's kind of an interesting case. Well, great. This has been tremendously fun for me and incredibly revealing and educational. I learned a lot from all of you. So thanks very much. And Zeynep, Tunç, if you want to come back on to say goodbye.
Thank you very much. This has been a terrific panel. We're grateful to each and every one of you and the good questions from the audience. So to be continued next semester.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye. Sure. Take care.
Before closing out the panel, let me just express again how sorrowful we are for the tragic loss of one of the valuable members of the Colombia community yesterday. So we really send our deepest condolences to Davide's family and loved ones, as well as in the entire Colombia community. So yes, thank you again for this really engaging conversation, and have a good rest of your days.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.